The examiner's report for AAA for the March 23 and June 23 exams has been released, and it is a goldmine of useful advice from the examiner. And if you haven't been onto the ACCA's website, downloaded a copy and had a good read of it for yourself, I would strongly suggest you do that. But here's my review of it. I'm going to give you my insights based on what the examiner has told us. But before I do that, just wanted to explain this. So we had a fancy dress party at the weekend, and this moustache was part of my costume, and I haven't yet grown my beard back enough to shave it off. So it's here for a couple of days only. It's here for a good time, not a long time. Right, into the good stuff. So here's the examiner's report, and well, it is full of really useful information, and a lot of it is actually very similar information to that which has been released from previous exam sittings. The key points for me, the first one is around the importance of planning, and the examiner refers to it a lot, particularly in question 1, but also in question 2 and question 3. And I make the point that it's obvious when a student doesn't plan, because where a student doesn't plan, their answers lack depth, because the student hasn't been able to consider all of the information given in the scenario and build linkages between the different facts. It's really important that you consider all the information and how it all fits together when you're writing your answer, because that allows you to write an answer that has depth. So if you're not planning already, there's loads of my guidance videos on my YouTube channel that show you how to plan using past exam questions. It is critical for AAA. The second point that I wanted to draw out here, that is in this report and in the previous one that was released 6 months ago, is that students are missing out on easy marks. If the verb in the question is discuss or evaluate, there's usually a mark for having a conclusion that links back to the requirement and says what you really think. Okay, get off the fence. Say yes or no, we should accept this engagement. Or no, the audit has been performed poorly, or the assignment's been done badly. So look back at the question, think about what they're really asking you, and have a short statement with a bit of an explanation saying what you really think. The next thing the examiner says this again and again and again in this report. Lots of students prepare for AAA by rote learning the textbook, and then in the exam they try and take that information that they rote learned and get as much of it down into their answer as possible, and that will earn you very few marks, if any. Okay, do not approach this exam by rote learning. This is not a technical exam, a tax exam where you have to show you know all the rules. Right? That is not what AAA is about. AAA is all about applying your knowledge to the scenario. So yes, you do need some knowledge, but what you get marks for in the exam is demonstrating that knowledge in the context of the scenario. And that's a real tough exam skill. That's why the pass rate is so low for AAA. And that's why on my course, we spend at least 80% of the time focusing on how you apply your knowledge to questions rather than just making sure you've got the knowledge. And another thing that the examiner says in this report, and they've said it in lots of previous reports, is you will not get marks for speculating. You will only get marks for discussing things that are in the scenario. You can't go beyond the scenario. And a good trick for that is don't use the word if. If this, then this would be a problem. Okay, if is not your friend in AAA. You need to directly analyse the facts that you're given in the scenario, and that's what you'll get marks for, not speculating and making things up. Looking at question 1 then in more detail, section A of the exam, the 50 marker, and if you want to have a look through the question, you can pause the recording here so that you can read through it. But it's a fairly typical question 1, a lot of marks around risk in part A, 18 marks, a lot of marks in part B around audit procedures, although some for justifying why inventory is a significant risk. And that's actually a lot of overlap with the first question, the risk analysis question. And then a standard ethics question in part C. So what I thought was important and interesting out of the examiner's comments here, firstly, a lot of people didn't follow the instructions. Okay, we were told, please use revenue as the basis for materiality. And a lot of people just did it based on PBT because they were following their process that they'd used in previous exam questions rather than responding to the specifics in the scenario. So it's really important that you look at what the question's actually asking you to do and follow the partner's instructions. Because if you did it on the wrong basis, if you did it on PBT rather than 0.5 to 1% of revenue, then not only would you lose the marks for your materiality calculations, really easy marks, you would also lose a professional skills mark for not following the partner's instructions. A double blow. Now, the first question here is 18 marks, right, for risks. And that means an absolute maximum you should be looking to analyse is 6 risks in depth, right? Because each risk that you analyse in either an audit risk or a ROM question like this one, risk of material misstatement, there were 3 marks per well-explained risk. And so you should be looking for 5 or maybe 6 that you analyse in depth. And that means having a full paragraph of 2, 3, maybe even 4 sentences to really develop your risk. You will not be able to pass this sort of question if you try to come up with a long list of 9 or 10 risks that you don't really evaluate. And something the examiner had commented on is that students were pretty good at identifying the risks, which doesn't earn many marks, and they were very bad at developing and evaluating and explaining those risks, which is worth lots of marks. So what you're looking for in this sort of question is a few risks that you really go to town on, not a long list of risks. Now, this is always a point in the examiner, mates. You are not going to score marks for pre-learned generic points. Your answer has to include the information in the scenario and then explain why it's a risk in the context of this particular scenario. Okay, if you're writing out something that you have learned from a previous exam answer, it is not going to score you many marks. The next thing is that students really lack depth with their answers, and it kind of links back to the point I was making about 6 risks maximum. It was in this risk section, but it is also in the procedures and also in the ethics section that students didn't explain themselves fully. Okay, so less is more. Right? You need fewer points, but you need to develop them fully. And finally, this question really focused on inventory. Right? And it's unusual for them to take one accounting standard and give you so many marks for demonstrating your knowledge of that accounting standard. But it does happen. Right? You need to be ready for them to test you on the detail of any accounting standard. So that means going back over your SBR notes. That means if you haven't studied SBR already, don't take AAA until you've already studied SBR. It's a common thing that students then struggle with AAA because they haven't already done SBR, and that might be you. On my course, I give you lots of resources to recap your SBR knowledge. I give you a full set of notes, and I give you a video from my good friend and mentor Tom Clendon from his SBR course, taking you through all of the relevant accounting standards. Okay, so we spend a lot of time making sure you've got that knowledge, and if you aren't doing my course, it's important that you do go back over your SBR knowledge to make sure it's sharp. This question focused on inventory, but in recent sittings, we've had pensions, we've had leases. You know, they take one accounting standard and they expect you to know quite a lot about it. So it's important your SBR knowledge is sharp. Now, section B of this exam, as always, one of the section B questions focused heavily on reporting. And this one was reporting to those charged with governance and then looking at key audit matters paragraph and critically evaluating it. If you want to read these requirements in more detail, pause the recording here. Now, things that I thought were important out of the examiner's comments here. Firstly, as always, this was the worst answered question on the exam paper. Reporting is the bit of the exam that students really struggle with. And so if you can write a half reasonable answer to a reporting question, you're going to be standing out to the examiner. Okay, when a question is answered badly, it tends to be marked more generously. Right? That's just what happens with the exam questions. So you now know that, so you know to focus your attention on reporting, because this is an area where you can really stand out. Across this whole question, students were okay at picking out the issues, but they were very bad at explaining why this internal control matter should be included. For explaining why these matters should be included in your report to those charged with governance, and explaining why these issues were problems with the key audit matters paragraph. Yeah, people okay at picking out the problem, people not explaining in enough depth why. So that's something you've got to do across the whole exam. Give that little bit of extra information to really develop your point fully. And in this key audit matters section, there was actually some information in here that should have been in a material uncertainty over going concern paragraph. And the examiner commented that there was a lot of confusion. Firstly, about what goes into a CAM section. And then secondly, students didn't understand the difference between a material uncertainty over going concern paragraph and an emphasis of matter paragraph. And so they wrote quite confused answers that showed that they didn't have the underlying technical knowledge. And again, this is an area I really focus on in my course. I know that students struggle with those extra paragraphs, so I give you lots of tricky topic tutorials around those extra paragraphs to make sure that you've got the knowledge that you need. Then the second section B question that they published. Now this was unusual. And look at this, right? If you're just glancing your eye down here, 12, 8, 5 and 7, that doesn't add up to 20. What's going on? Well, depending on which variant of the exam you were sitting, if you were an international person, you got this 12 marker. And if you were a UK or Ireland person, if you're a Singapore person, you got this 12 marker. UK and Ireland variant, you got a slightly different question that focused on insolvency. This is the first time in the last couple of years that we've had a question that has been UK or Ireland specific. I don't know if that trend is going to continue, but I do know that this is the examiner showing we need to be ready for anything. So if you are doing the UK or Irish variant, you need to make sure that you're hot on the extra topic of insolvency, just in case it comes up again. I don't think it will, because the examiner doesn't like to repeat themselves, particularly where they have published an exam question, but we never know. So you need to be ready for it. And then everybody got this final question, which was focusing on a cash flow forecast and looking at the assumptions. A very standard question that we see coming up quite a lot in AAA. So what was interesting then out of the examiner's comments? Firstly, well, commenting on rote learning, right? Particularly for this international and Singapore variant. Okay, students rote learnt points about quality management rather than responding to the specifics of the scenario. And as I've already said at the start of this recording, there's no credit in AAA for demonstrating rote learned knowledge. Okay, you have to start with the scenario, facts from the scenario, and then explain why they're a problem. And using that verb, evaluate, it means you need a bit of depth to each point to score the marks that are available. Tailoring to the scenario. Now, across this whole question, but particularly in part B, you had to write specific points. So the particular assumptions in this forecast, and they even said that, explain why particular assumptions should be challenged and approached with skepticism. So what you needed to do is take each assumption and then look at the wider narrative information you were given and the numbers to explain why that assumption doesn't quite add up with the other information that you're given. And there's a big hint about which professional skills mark there's going to be lots of in this particular question. Obviously, it's judgment and professional skepticism. And you would get those marks, both technical and professional skills marks, for questioning with authority. Looking at those assumptions and challenging them, saying they don't quite fit with the narrative information I'm given and the numbers. And finally, here the verb was evaluate. Here the verb was discuss. Here the verb was evaluate. If you had a nice simple conclusion that linked back to the requirement, so for example here in part A, what the question is asking is, should we take on the client? And so your conclusion is to say, yes, we should take them on for this reason, or no, we shouldn't take them on for this reason that I've developed in more detail in my answer. But getting off the fence and really saying what you think is going to earn you an easy mark. I hope you found this debrief or this video useful, assessing the examiner's report for March and June 23. Get in touch if you need help with AAA.